Hello again for our fourth week. We're a little delayed, but we are here.
That's true. Holidays are always a little rough on people.
Once again, I am Ian Price.
And I am not Jane Cobb, no matter what the hat might make you think.
We are here to discuss Downbelow, the role-playing game, and we actually planned ahead last week for what we're going to talk about this week, so we're going to talk about geography.
Now, that's not fair. We do plan ahead a lot of weeks, but we really laid out a bit of a roadmap last
Yes,
week.
but we told them what we'd planned for.
Yes, that's true. All right, so geography. And when I say geography, I mean a little more than just geography. Let's talk about the place itself. I've been mentioning the term Nuevo Paradiso for a while, and there's some things that should be taken for granted. For instance, is that the city that the setting is based off of? Yes, it is.
And we've talked a little bit about this in what we've already written down for you, but just to go over the basics, Nuevo Paradiso is an artificially constructed island. It exists off the coast of Brazil, roughly near the equator. It is far enough off the coast that even if the multi-kilometer tall, stretching out of the atmosphere orbital elevator were to fall, it could not possibly fall on land, and that's why it was constructed there. And it is not it is not belonging to any nationality, because when it was first created, no nationality wanted to take responsibility should it fail.
Now, specifically, it could be in the Pacific Ocean, it could be the Atlantic Ocean. It's really not important exactly where it is right now. I've been actually thinking it's in more of the Pacific Ocean, because that makes the Russian ties and the Chinese ties easier, because they have to cover less ground.
The one who originally told me it was off the coast of Brazil has been thinking of it as in the Pacific Ocean, which is not where Brazil is. So that tells you how specific he cares about the geography.
Exactly. I mean, like I said, the important part is it's equatorial. When it becomes important, it might be important where to place it. I've been also thinking it's closer to Australia than, by closer to Australia, that would again mean Pacific Ocean as opposed to further down south. Anyway, so the thing is, the basic setting, as I mentioned, the city was originally founded as a space elevator. The original idea was that it would be just that. It would be simply the landing platform for a space elevator. It would be a freight airport, a freight shipping port, and the terminus of the elevator project. And that sort of spiraled out of hand, because first there were the workers who were building it, then there were the various, along the way, various interests, mostly commercial interests moved in. Then along came, not squatters specifically, but one thing led to another.
Basically 3 stages of unplanned, or rather, sort of planned into a little bit planned, but haphazardly at the last minute, into not at all planned. The sort of planned was workers. There was planned worker housing. It just wasn't expected that they would end up staying. But that was relatively planned for, because that rolls over into the sort of planned but haphazardly at the last minute of, well, now that there's people here full-time, both to work and people who worked on the initial construction who just didn't ever leave, there needs to be services for them, and so the people who work providing those services also want to live here, because logistically you don't want to commute over an ocean to your job, even in the technological future. And
if you're living here, you want services, and if you're offering services, you want relaxation. If you're offering relaxation, you need to bring in more people.
So that all goes into the relatively planned pile, but then comes the completely unplanned pile of people that showed up because there was so much travel through here, as well as just once you get a certain number of people coming in for any reason, you're going to get transients who end up staying.
So that is not at all what I want to talk about tonight. What I want to talk about is the fact that Nuevo Paradiso is huge. It was not originally planned to be huge, but it had to be huge. As it was mentioned, we are talking about a kilometers-high orbital elevator. This sort of thing takes ballast. If you're putting it out in the ocean, this actually is going to take arguably more, because a smaller landing platform is going to get tossed around unless you're actually putting it on an island, which is, surprise, mostly stable because it reaches the ocean floor. Nuevo Paradiso did not originally reach the ocean floor. It does now. So, when I say huge, I mean the landmass, the artificial landmass of Nuevo Paradiso is, A, it is so large that there are points near the center where you cannot see the ocean. It is so large that it would be difficult for someone to walk from one side to the other in a day. It is so large that you could fit the greater Chicagoland metropolitan area onto this island. And it's not just the island. The surface area is that big. There are also two other areas that I want to briefly discuss, and those are the wave breaks and the support pillars. So let's get started. We don't have too much time, so I'm going to breeze through this really quick. The first thing is, obviously, the surface area. This is what most people think of when they think of Nuevo Paradiso. This is, by its nature, mostly concentrically designed. The center of it is, in fact, the space elevator. It is literally in the middle of everything.
And I would like to note that when we talk about surface area, we are not literally only talking about stuff that sees the sky. We are talking about everything that is actually on the proper island and livable. Mm-hmm. This goes down several stories below the island's surface, and that's part of why the game is called Downbelow, because a lot of action happens on the quote-unquote surface of the island, where you actually are below the street level.
There's actually an even bigger reason it's called Downbelow, which we haven't gotten to yet. I will get there, I'll get there in this update, but we've got to keep going. So, as I mentioned, the literal center of everything is the elevator. Radiating out like spokes are main thoroughfares. There is more than one airport, there is more than one seaport. There are basically at least two of each. This is, again, not because of any specific logistical design, but especially because the idea was that there would be shipments coming and going at all hours. The more runways on different approaches you have, the less likely it is that short of a typhoon you're going to get shut down. The more different seaports you have, the easier it is to avoid snarls with eastbound and westbound, northbound, southbound ships. Basically,
each of the major ports has 3 types of thoroughfare to and from the elevator. There is the air lane, where helicopter and short-distance plane will transport priority or private cargo. There is the maglev thoroughfare, which is, again, for priority things, but more for bulk, rapid shipments. And then there are regular old highways, because what ain't broke doesn't get fixed, and it still exists in this universe.
And most importantly, the island is big enough for there to be highways. This is actually important. This is not... This might even be an island larger than Rhode Island. So, radiating out from that, you have a variety of things. At the dead center is Yggdrasil corporate territory. That's literally it. You don't have space in the space elevator unless you are or are renting from Yggdrasil Corporation. Period. Next to that is an inner ring of warehouses. Warehouses, high-rises, and so warehouses, very important worker living quarters. So corporate living quarters that are, for whatever reason, outside the tower proper, and other important immediate amenities, corporate car fleets, etc. Those are stored in the inner ring. The middle ring, well, the inner middle ring. There's an inner middle ring and an outer middle ring. The inner middle ring is where the affluent are located. If we're talking about the entertainers, they're located there. If we're talking about mid-level corporate workers, offices, non-Yggdrasil offices are located there. Most of the upper-class shopping is there. The upper-class dining is there. The upper-class living areas are there. This is the middle inner ring. The inner middle ring. The outer middle ring is the lower-class places. If you are a lower-class citizen and living on the island, you live in the outer middle ring. It's that simple. This is where the manual labor is. This is where the cheap restaurants are. This is where the sweatshops that are on the island are. Yes, there are some of those there. This is where the the low cost vehicle rentals are. This is where the slums are. There are not many slums, but they exist. And then finally there's the outer ring, and the outer ring is mostly not livable for a variety of reasons. Number one, it is the most exposed to the elements. There are sheltered beaches. Even on the outer ring there are enclaves of places that are, for whatever reason, very high profile. There's a spot on both the north and the south that is largely out of the wind. This is out of place because it's outer ring, but it happens to be a very high-class resort.
And there's similarly some places which are just barely livable despite the exposure to the elements, where people have set up their own living quarters despite the fact that they're not supposed to, but it's not worth anybody's effort to displace them.
So that's the basic geography. You'll notice that I kept it kind of on the down low about what's where, and that's basically because, the exact geography doesn't matter. When this goes to print, there will probably be a map of Nuevo Paradiso. This will be for reference more than for specifics. If you need there to be a seedy dive bar for your game, it is more important that you know this should be in the outer middle ring than that you need to be at the corner of 5th and Main.
What you'll need to know is that the bar might be roughly this far from the center, and it should take roughly this long to get to various different types of location.
Right.
And that the person who owns it, unless they're a struggling owner who's actually of the class of the outer middle ring types, probably actually lives in the inner middle ring and might own several different properties. And that this goes whether they are a legitimate businessman or a Chicago-style legitimate businessman.
Now, we talked about on the surface. There are a couple of things that are happening under the surface. The first is technically under the surface. As Ian mentioned, there are places literally below sea level. This is not quite the down below. This is what everyone thinks it means when they say down below in world, but it's not actually what gave it the name. Again, coming very soon, I promise. The first layer below sea level is basically literally the same as the layer at sea level. You have the tower itself is in the middle, and that extends down again for ballast. You want to go down below the sea level to make it less rocky up above. The inner middle ring is mostly the affluent. It's a little less affluent down there because you're literally underwater at this point.
But basically most buildings just list one below street level as ground floor and at the top street level as floor 1.
So basically, just a little bit down below the sea surface, it's functionally the same as above the surface with less fresh air. For some people this is appealing, for some people this is not appealing, and mostly it's a status symbol to live up above. Living down below costs you a little less, but is basically functionally the same. No, the place it got the term down below was actually from the term working down below. And here's where I promised we'd get there. I mentioned that these days Nuevo Paradiso extends to the seafloor. This is true. It did not originally. The plan was always for it to go that far down, but it started off as just a floating island, and it was as it was built out, it was also built down to stabilize the part that was being built up to the troposphere. And it's not just pillars all the way down. These pillars have integrated machinery. When it became apparent that the island was going to support more than just a working handful, the designers actually added to it. Going down the pillars, there are algae farms, there is water purification, there are hydroelectric generators that are powered off of deep-sea currents, there are thermal generators that actually feed off of sea vents in the underfloor.
And in fact, the entire structure, while it's described as pillars by and for the benefit of lay people, is actually a lot more complex than that, because it's really made up of things like cables and complex interconnecting systems that are there to provide stability for both itself and what's above, because you got to do a lot of work to pretend that you have something as stable as millions of years of volcanic rock buildup.
The reason it's called pillars is it's not just a solid column all the way to the ground. It needs to be large enough for flexion to happen. It needs to be large enough for the currents to flow through, and basically think of it as multiple pillars. The big theme here, though, is isolation. If you're in one of the pillars, you can't just walk to the next one over. You have to go up and over and around. Sometimes you have to change pressure levels. It's not happy. And this is actually literally where this is where the term down below came from, because what would happen is when you went to work a shift down below, you'd go to work there for a shift of anywhere from a week to a month or more, because even more so than commuting across the ocean. You commute across the ocean, if you have a fast enough plane, you're losing a couple hours to commute between offshore islands and the mainland, and maybe your ears pop. You commute up and down pressure levels, we're talking about decompression, we're talking about possible major physical changes. The shift designers decided, rather than lose several hours to decompression every day, we'll make you work long shifts, and then you'll take decent leaves. This was not a desirable shift. However, there were some people who were very willing to work it, and these are the people who are desperate, who are willing to work off the books, who are willing not to call the oversight on humane working conditions, because eating was more important, and these were the people who were sent, wait for it, down below.
And even the down below workers who worked the recommended 2 weeks on, 1 week off, and were relatively well treated by their jobs, became a separate class of citizen, because they didn't end up talking the same way as other people, because they'd been in isolation with each other for so long. They were different. And when you create this special class in any situation, you end up with a class distinction. And so that became the core of that distinct class, especially when the construction was mostly over. And so in modern Nuevo Paradiso, you have a lot of people who still live and try to find some kind of work on Nuevo Paradiso, who form the core of the down below community, who used to work down below, but there's not as much work down below anymore.
This is also why there is, and actually largely why there is organized crime on this island. A lot of things are legalized. Most recreational drugs are legalized. Various forms of adult entertainment that are anywhere from illegal to highly controlled these days are legalized. Health regulations are there. Why is there still illicit traffic in drugs? Well, there are people who want to have them when they're not supposed to have them. If you are working half a mile below sea level and it takes way too long to get up to the surface and you're not supposed to have your fix when you're down below, maybe you're willing to pay a little extra for people to get stuff that you're not supposed to have, because even when you're on shift, you're not on shift 24 hours a day. You've got your 8 hours to 12 hours of leave time while you're down there. You just can't really leave the post. This is like, there again, it's like being on a submarine. If you're a sailor on a submarine, you work your shifts, you have your breaks, and then you have some time to sleep if there's no emergencies. You have time to relax. Well, even alcohol is not really legit down there. You don't want to be around a whole bunch of delicate equipment when you have someone drinking, because everyone's a different kind of drunk. But there are people who are willing to pay extra to less than licit channels to get the stuff they wanted down there, and that really helped keep a criminal and underground economy going in the down below setting.
And once it got started, it was self-sustaining, because once there was an underground economy, quite literally in this case, it had momentum, and it had people who were invested in keeping themselves in this sort of unscrupulous power they had gained for themselves.
Even though there's less and less need for a literal underwater economy in this case, there's still plenty of things that people don't want being seen. Maybe it's legal to be addicted to crystal meth in Down Below. Maybe it's legal to drop LSD every night in the safety of your own home. But maybe you don't want your boss knowing that you are partaking in this totally legal but controlled substance. Maybe you don't. Maybe you have your family has moral obligations. There's plenty of reasons for people to want to go for off the books stuff.
Convenience being one of them, because Nuevo Paradiso, another thing about its location and logistics, which relates pretty directly to geography, is that things which the system is supposedly perfectly good for in this quasi-utopian future, the problem of bureaucracy shows itself way more in the isolated scenario of Nuevo Paradiso, because even if you have a legitimate citizenship to work with, which is a problem for a lot of people in the Downbelow economy, even if you could legally get a lot of these drugs, you're going to find yourself not getting as much of you as you want when you want through the system necessarily, because you have to deal with a bureaucracy which is going to decide based on its logistics and its idea of community good. And we're trying to record here. And sorry about that. And so the system is going to tell you one answer, and there's nothing you can do to make it budge. But if you go outside the system, then you can say, I am willing to pay. And someone will say, well, as long as you can pay and be discreet, I am willing to sell.
Now, we mentioned isolation, and while there is less hard labor going down on the pillars than there used to be, due to the fact that they're there, and there's always going to be work needed there. At the minimum, you need some sort of presence to keep them in repair, you need some presence to harvest the algae, you need some presence to oversee the water filtration, etc., 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 but there's no longer massive shifts going down there every week to literally build the place. There are still people down there, so there's still some isolation there, but there's also another part that I mentioned, which is the wave breaks. You get people out, you get a place out in the deep ocean, and waves are huge. They may not break as often as they do because they're not coming over the rapidly approaching seafloor, but the water level varies wildly. Sea level is not a single level thing. And if you're on a boat that's floating on top of the water, sometimes this is a big issue, but most of the time it's not. If you're on an island that's supposed to actually maintain level, it kind of is. So at some point during the construction, this became, it was probably always known, but it became obvious that there would need to be secondary construction out there, a giant seawall, if you will, that actually might be several miles offshore, just to break up the waves, just to keep the swells down. These were not originally supposed to be livable. Basically, the view, once it was decided that their aesthetics were an issue, the view was supposed to be something like a heavily wooded island off the coast of Nuevo Paradiso. But where there is space and where people see a need for space, there are people who are going to want to live there. Some of these islands have in fact become literally livable. They've become honeycombed with living structures. Some of them are even high class, some of them are low class. There's one of them that basically acts as almost a wilderness preserve for people to go hiking in. They are limited largely to one side because the seaward side still has a lot of waves crashing over it. But these things, again, these are big enough that you could fit entire towns on them without overflowing the wave break. They are separate, smaller islands. And as they are several miles offshore, while they're not as disconnected as some people might be, they're not exactly something you can just pop down to the corner store for a bag of chips. If you happen to be on one of the isolated ones, it can take hours to get back to the mainland of Nuevo Paradiso and check in.
There's going to be 4 distinct types of place that we're going to detail for you, at the very least, that will be on the wave breaks. As mentioned, the official live on the wave break semi-affordable honeycomb housing. There's the nature resort hiking trail / really upscale. There's some high-class living availability there. And then there's going to be an extreme sports type of thing that we're going to detail, which has more to do with the waves side of the island, because where there are waves, there will be people doing various extreme wave-related sports, including surfing and big wave parasailing and things like that. And then there's going to be the squatters, because there's a community of people, at least one community of people, living on the wave breaks, because on any individual wave break it would be a different community, who aren't supposed to be there, but they are sometimes self-sufficient, and certainly mutually supporting, and definitely mutually supporting in the interest of staying off the radar of the authorities, who would kick them out because they would say safety reasons, and that's actually rather true, but that still to these people would kick them out of their homes and into homelessness.
So, before we wrap up really quick, we've been talking a lot about what there is. We've also been keeping it fast and loose. How do you use that? Basically, here's what it is. The first thing is that, even with a roadmap to Nuevo Paradiso, we will detail some of the landmarks, but you're intended to fill in the details that you need. Some people will need film noir clubs. Some people will not need that. Some people will need corporate high-rises. Other people could not care less about that. We're not going to spend too much time detailing literally every single city block of the island, because what you need and what we give you are not necessarily going to be the same thing. We'll give you some of the key installations, because these are key. These are literal linchpins of the island. Beyond that, if you need Sam Spade's club to be in the northwest corner, you put it there.
And we're going to give you zones. The zones, as we've mentioned, the elevator itself, which extends to Yggdrasil District at its base. The inner ring, just outside of Yggdrasil District. The inner middle ring, where affluent people live, as opposed to the inner ring, which is where affluent people's money lives, basically. The outer middle ring, which is where people with crappy lives live, and probably where most of the action of the game will take place. And the true outer ring, where interesting stuff can happen. It's more of a set-piece location. Then the wave breaks.
Before I get on to the next part of how you can use this, I will point this out about the rings. If you think about it in terms of a big circle, you will notice that as the closer you get to the center, the smaller they get. This is intentional. This is actually intended to be the size of the game impact. It is the more central you get, the less of the game world it takes up. This is a handy choice. It's not entirely an intentional choice, but once I was realizing it was going that way, I decided to adopt it, because that's the interesting thing. The vast majority of the game will take place outside the area where the money is.
And especially since the economically similar area to the outer middle ring extends and expands as you go down into the lower reaches of the second, third, and fourth sub-basements of the island, that is geographically the largest area of the island and the biggest game impact.
So the next part is, how else do you use that? Well, here's the other part. This may be not only is this a big place, but this is a place with a lot of isolation. A common thing about games in general is that a lot of GMs have complained to me that things get easier the more support players can call in. Whether this be the Dark Heresy Commissar, who always has a minimum of 3 guard regiments on call, the Shadowrun player who somehow has a corporate contact in their back pocket, the D&D player who has the local clergy and the local knights ready to come when they whistle. The less PCs have to rely on themselves and more support they're able to call in from elsewhere, the easier the game gets. In Firefly, one of the things that makes it important is that the crew of Firefly can literally only rely on themselves for the most part. Even when they don't have the right tool for the job, they have to make do with what they have. in this setting, despite it being near future or medium future, despite it being high tech, despite it being an island literally whistled up just to support a space elevator. How cool is that? There are large places. There are large places of isolation. There are large pockets where things happen outside of people's view. We've given you a couple, and we've given you the places to put several more. There are places, even in a surveillance-heavy world, where it's not just security through obscurity, and that's something we'll be talking about in a little bit about the information technology and security technology in Downbelow. Not this time, but probably next time. Even in an information-heavy world, it's not just security through too much data, it's security through we can't find them. There's too much stuff there.
So what we are going to do with the geography of Downbelow, with these different zones that we've told you about, is we are going to treat each zone of Nuevo Paradiso as a toolbox, and we are going to tell you not only how you can create an area in that zone to work in your game to serve a purpose, but how you could create a similar zone in any city, anywhere, and not only anywhere on Earth, but anywhere in a space colony like Lagrange City, or even if you wanted to set your game somewhere with maximum isolation, somewhere in one of the extrasolar colonies.
And honestly, in anywhere else, the biggest difference between anywhere else and Downbelow is that because it is going to be something geographically much more organic, the areas are likely to be more interspersed. You're likely to see several high-class enclaves in the middle of medium-class housing. You're likely to see several business districts scattered around multiple strategic arteries of a city. Down in Nuevo Paradiso, it just so happens that because of the artificial nature of it, city planning at its accidental finest has kept things largely concentrated into the rings.
And for the purposes of running a game, it actually won't make any difference whatsoever, but the convenient visual separation will make it easier for us to build that toolbox for you.
And just like in Chicago, if the trains are actually running on time, you can in fact easily get from point A to point B in the city with a minimum of hassle in the course of a couple hours tops.
So, what we're going to talk about next time, first thing as mentioned, we're going to go into security technologies, surveillance technologies, and general level of computer interconnectedness in Downbelow.
And similarly, we're going to answer the important question: in a society where pretty much everything you do is on the grid somewhere, how does one actually get up to no good?
And combined with those things, we're going to talk about story structure. What is a typical story structure for a Downbelow game, and why do we think that this is the good story structure? It's going to boil down to a little bit of mystery and a little bit of personal drama.
Which, honestly, boils down to, let's talk about a lot of film noir.
So we will see you next week. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting us.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.